Hello, Agile fans, and welcome to the next episode of Agile Bytes, the podcast that's powered by integrity-inspired solutions, where we build Agile software day in and day out. I'm Phil Ledgerwood, and I want to rock right now, and I am here to get down. Today, we're going to talk about something that most people associate with Kanban. But did you know that these also appear in Scrum? In fact, I would argue that every individual and every team has these things in place. It's just usually they're unconscious as opposed to conscious. Well, we're going to be making the unconscious conscious today because today we're talking about limits on your work in progress, known for short as WIP limits. We all have WIP limits, and what we're talking about is the fact that we can only effectively have so many things going on at once, only so many things in flight. You can think about your personal life this way, right? We can only effectively have so many things we're working on, so many plates spinning, so many balls in the air at any given time. And as that number begins to increase, the complexity grows until all of a sudden things start falling through the cracks. So a lot of times as individuals, when we feel like our lives are kind of getting out of control, what do? We start reducing the number of things that we need to focus on. We focus on the things that are truly important. And by narrowing that range of things down, we're a lot more effective. And even psychologically, it's a lot easier to deal with. Well, it turns out that not only Kanban, but Scrum has limits on your work in progress. We're going to talk about those today. And I'm going to show you how using limits on your work in progress are not just kind of a rule or a cool thing to do. They can actually make you much, much faster. Now, how does this work? There's a mathematical formula called Little's Law that was developed to calculate things like, given a certain amount of things in line, how long are they going to stand in that line? And Little's Law is used to create approximations for things like the flow of shoppers into and out of stores, how long people have to wait for service. I even saw a video one time where someone used Little's Law on ride lines at Disney World to show, like, on the basis of how many people we've got and how fast people are moving through, how long could people likely spend in the lines. Now, I will tell you that even if I were in person and had a whiteboard, explaining exactly how Little's Law works out for software development is not the most interesting topic in the world. So I'm not going to talk about that here, but I'm going to jump straight to the end. What Little's Law expresses for software development is a relationship where our cycle time, in other words, how long does it take to get an item done? That's the cycle time. Our cycle time is equal to the number of items we currently have in progress divided by our throughput. Okay, so if you're thinking about this in your heads, cycle time is on one side of the equation. Okay, the time it takes for an individual item to get done equals work in progress over our throughput. So our throughput is how fast we complete things. Our work in progress is how many things we've got going on at once, right? How many things we're waiting to complete. Now, it may have been a while since some of you have been back at school and studying fractions. It certainly is for me. But if you think about one number over another number, if you think about that as a fraction, let's take a fraction like 1/2, for example. If you wanted that number to get smaller, what could you do? Well, one thing you could do is you could make the bottom number larger, right? 1/3 is smaller than 1/2. 1/4 is smaller than 1/2. 1/100th is smaller than 1/2. So if you change the bottom number, if you make that bigger, then the total number becomes smaller, right? And this is true with our little cycle time equation here, because if you could somehow increase your throughput, in other words, if you could get more things done over time, then the cycle times would go down. The time it took to get something done would go down. And this is where most people focus their time. And you start looking at things like, what is the waste that we can cut out of our software development so that it's faster? Do we need to add people? Do we need to have people start working overtime? What you're trying to do is increase production capacity, because by doing that, that brings the time down. But here's the problem with that. To make that number bigger, to make the bottom number, the throughput number, to make that larger, we're kind of limited in what we can do. I mean, we can try all kinds of things that maybe work, maybe don't. We can cut all the inefficiency and wait time out of our process, and that will certainly help. I highly recommend people doing that, but there's going to be a limit. Ultimately, work is going to take as long as it takes, and you can't whittle it down anymore. You're going to hit that limit. It's sort of like when you're trying to save money. You can either make more money or you can cut costs, but there's a limit to how much you can cut costs, right? Eventually, you're gonna hit rock bottom. It's that same with increasing our throughput. And as we all know, throughput is notoriously difficult to improve, as most of us in the field have experienced. But the other way you can bring that number down is to not just make the lower number bigger, but make the top number smaller. 3/4 is bigger than 1/4. 3/18 is bigger than 2/18. So if you think about fractions, either the number on the bottom gets bigger and the total number gets smaller, or the number on top gets smaller and the total number gets smaller. Now, we don't have a lot of control over what our throughput is going to be. In other words, the bottom number, but we have all kinds of control over the top number. We get to decide how many things do we want to be working on at once. Now, notice we're not talking about controlling the total number of things we have to get done eventually. We're just talking about how many things can we effectively work on at once. And so you can see by Little's Law, the smaller you make that number, the shorter and shorter the cycle times are going to get. So the more limits you have, the smaller those limits are, the faster individual items are going to get completed. Now, it's usually at this point that people raise an objection and they go, okay, Phil, so maybe I buy that, maybe I don't. I know it's math, but we're also skeptical of math, aren't we? All the numbers and all the symbols, and you can just use math to prove anything. But how is this really giving me benefit? Because if I've got 10 items that are due at the end of the month, they're due at the end of the month, right? It doesn't really matter. Well, it does matter, because if we're talking about incremental delivery and getting feedback, getting one thing done early has huge advantages over getting all 10 things done at the end of the month. It's much better throughout that month to get something done and out, something done and out, something done and out, than to have everything in progress for a month and then deliver it all at the end. So keeping our cycle times down is very important, and keeping our WIP small is one of the easiest ways we can do that. So what does that look like? Well, I want to talk to my Scrum peeps here for a second, because if you're doing Scrum, you might be thinking right now, well, we don't have WIP limits. That's a Kanban thing. But you do, because in Scrum, you've got two things that work together to make your WIP limit. One is the sprint goal. So every sprint, your team is coming up with the goal for that sprint. That goal acts as a constraint on the amount of work you take on for that sprint, because not all of your backlog items are affiliated with the sprint goal. You're trying to pick the work that's available to fulfill the sprint goal. So that acts as a limit on how much work you pull into the sprint. The second thing is the sprint length itself. Is your sprint 1 week? Is your sprint 2 weeks? Is your sprint 4 weeks? Whatever that time box is, that acts as a limit on how much work you can pull in. If my team gets 2 user stories done a week and my sprints are 2 weeks long, it doesn't make sense to pull in 8 stories. They're not going to get it done. 4 is probably my max. So the sprint goal plus the length of your sprint forms the WIP limit in Scrum. It's just that the limit applies to a whole sprint. But I would argue that if you really want to supercharge your Scrum development, if you really want to get things done faster and in front of customers faster, I would encourage you to take a chapter out of Kanban's book, and within your sprint, also try to keep your amount of items in progress low. If you decide you're going to get 4 user stories done in the sprint, don't start all 4 of them simultaneously. Now you've got 4 things in progress. But if you just pick 1 and have your developers focus on that, or maybe 2, and have them focus on those 1 or 2 things, you're going to get those done much more quickly than if you started all 4 at once. And then those things can be tested. You might even start showing them to a user or 2, even before your review. And so those limits can make you even faster, aside from the limits that Scrum provides. Now, for my Kanban folks, we already know about WIP limits, don't we? because this is something that Kanban requires, although it is interesting to me that this is the part of Kanban people hate the most. Even people who are quote unquote doing Kanban are often very leery about WIP limits and sometimes won't introduce them at all, which is fascinating to me. I even remember one time I was at a meeting of the Limited WIP Society and somebody asked, is anybody actually using WIP limits? It was a meeting of the Limited WIP Society. But it just goes to show that even amongst the most conscientious of Kanban practitioners, there's still a resistance to WIP limits. It still doesn't feel right. It still feels too constraining. Well, like I already showed you, there's a very good reason for those limits, and that is because the lower our limits are, the stronger limits we have in place, the faster individual items are going to move through our system, which means we can get that thing in front of the customer sooner. We can get our feedback sooner. Everything goes the way we need it to, instead of having 4, 5, 8, 10 things just kind of hanging around, all being partially done forever and ever and ever. So most of you, if you're doing Kanban, you're probably familiar already with putting WIP limits on individual columns on your Kanban board. We want to have a WIP limit for development, a WIP limit for testing, a WIP limit for requirements, maybe a WIP limit for our prioritized queue between us and our backlog. And when you're just kind of starting out with Kanban, I think that's a fine way to do it. You know, this might be the first time you've really thought about limiting WIP in your system, and that might be a really good way to do it. I would encourage you, however, that as you begin to grow in your Kanban practice, that you begin to have your WIP limits cover larger and larger areas of the system, as opposed to having column-specific WIP limits, because ultimately those are going to keep you from optimizing exactly where you need to optimize. When WIP limits are tied to columns, we can kind of WIP limit our way out of a lot of flow problems, and it disguises where our constraint actually is. So again, if you want to start there, I think that's great. It's often an easy way for teams to get going with WIP limits. But as you get used to it, start expanding those limits across the system. So instead of having one limit for testing, one for development, and one for requirements, maybe you just have one limit that covers all three of those. And then you can start really seeing where does work start to batch up, right? Where your bottlenecks actually are and where your constraints are. So you have a WIP limit over the whole system to keep things from getting too crazy, but you're not really restricting flow anywhere with your WIP limits, and you can kind of see more naturally the way your work flows. The other thing I would encourage you to do, and this applies to both Scrum and Kanban people, is to make the limits as small as you possibly can without having tons and tons of idleness all the time. It's okay occasionally for people to have to go quote unquote idle because you're at your WIP limit. I've never met the development team that couldn't find valuable things to do besides start a new user story. There's always things that need to be done. There's always more testing that could be done, tests that could be written, documentation that could be updated. There's always a new technical skill to learn. There's always junior level devs that can be helped with their work. So we want these limits to be as small as we can possibly get them. The other benefit we get from the low limits, besides just speed, is it begins to sort of force the team to swarm. This is an Agile Bytes podcast we did several episodes ago where we talk about the benefits of swarming. Well, one of the ways to get that done is to set your WIP limits low so that you can't have each individual having their own work item. In fact, when I'm starting with a brand new team and we really have no clue what our WIP limits ought to be, kind of the thing that I like to do is, let's say we're setting a WIP limit for development. I'll ask, how many developers do we have? And let's say we have 6. So what I'll do is I'll take the number of people we have, subtract 2, and that's my WIP limit, just to start out with. It's probably wrong, okay? But until we start observing flow, it's going to be hard to really nail down what those limits should be. But by starting that way, I'm already constraining the work so that somebody's got to work with somebody else, at least part of the time. Now, ideally, what I want to do is keep whittling those down and down and down and down and down as much as I can get them while we still have people being productive, because as low as you can get the WIP limits, that's as fast as things can be moving through your system. So that's the direction you want to go. But you do also get that benefit of, if your WIP limit is lower than people, then people are going to have to pair up. They're going to have to team up. They may even have to mob up. So that's a great reason for people to start setting those lower WIP limits. Usually when people start out, they think about like taking the amount of people and doubling it, or setting the WIP limit equal to the amount of people. I just encourage you not to do that. Go ahead and take your number of people, cut one or two off of that, make that your starting limit, see how it goes, and watch the people team up on these things. So I hope I've demonstrated to you that using WIP limits actually doesn't hold you back. It makes you faster. The lower your limits are, the faster individual items will move through your system. The shorter time from start to finish is what you're going to experience with your work items. And in an Agile environment, this is so important, because it isn't just about getting a certain quantity of items done by a certain deadline. It's about getting items in front of a customer or a user as soon as you possibly can, so you can get feedback as soon as you possibly can, so you can make improvements and adjustments as soon as you possibly can. And a great tool in your toolbox to make sure that that happens as quickly as possible is setting WIP limits. Thanks everyone for listening to Agile Bites. Agile does sometimes bite, but we don't think it always has to. If you enjoyed what you heard today, don't forget to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you happen to be using. And if you can, leave us a comment, because we'd love to hear your feedback. What things would you like to hear about? What things did you hear that were valuable to you today? You can also head over to integrityinspired.com to sign up to our email list. But that's all for today, folks. We'll see you next time.